मिरज पंढरपूर प्लॅट क्रमांक 7 वर लावण्यात आलेली आहे. पुणे पंढरपूर. पुणे ते वीरपर्यंत जाणारी बस, पुणे ते वीरपर्यंत जाणारी बस प्लॅट क्रमांक 4 वर लावण्यात आलेली आहे. पुणे ते बिदर 5:30 सुटणारी पुणे ते बिदर सोलापूर मार्गे जाणारी बस प्लॅट क्रमांक 8 वर लावण्यात आलेली. पुणे बिदर. बस नंबर 8800 पुणे ते इंदापूर. बस नंबर 8800 पुणे ते इंदापूर प्लॅट क्रमांक 9 वर लावण्यात आलेली. पुणे इंदापूर. नाशिक ते मिरज जाणारी बस प्लॅट क्रमांक 2 च्या समोर आडवी लावण्यात आलेली. नाशिक मिरज सातारा इस्लामपूर सांगली मिरज प्लॅट क्रमांक 2 च्या समोर आडवी लावण्यात आलेली आहे. बस नंबर 8800 5:45 से या 5:45 में छूटने वाली पुणे इंदापुर बस प्लेटफॉर्म क्रमांक 9 पे खड़ी है. बस नंबर 8800 5:45 में छूटने वाली पुणे इंदापुर बस प्लेटफॉर्म नंबर 9 पे खड़ी है.
Good evening. My lecture tonight is about an extraordinary figure in the history of Indian music. Of course he's extraordinary. Otherwise, why would I even want to speak about him? And who would want to even hear about him? You know how often several streams in life come together? It happens all the time. Carl Gustav Jung, the psycho-guru, once called such moments synchronicity. Mostly we ignore them. But in this case, I did not, to be frank. I simply could not ignore this coincidence. But let me start at the beginning. My friend Samuel Dublai is an adventurous, open-minded vocalist of Khayal music. Together we have founded an ensemble for explorations in Indian music, ensemble Sangeet Prayog. This ensemble is located in Pune, in the state of Maharashtra, the city name you just heard in the bus announcements. There in Pune, during a rehearsal a few years ago, we were discussing how our experimental Indian music would sound to Indian ears. Would it meet the Indian standards for musical beauty? Would they even admit it to be music? Samir told us a story about his father. I think he wanted to demonstrate to us how people in India reacted to experimental music, even when they were supposedly westernized, modern-minded scientists. We always record our conversations for research purposes, so I actually have a recording of this moment.
When my father was in his college days, and my father was a science man, so when he was working on a project on sound, told me one day that suddenly while doing an experiment, there was a discussion between his professors about a gentleman from Germany who was basically an Indian person who moved some decades back to Germany for his studies. He was working with the lab to which those professors belonged. He was a kind of a funny man. He always kept on saying that whatever you say is music to you is actually not music, it's only sound. And then there are different kinds of sound which the so-called musicians should explore. And he would come up with some strange sounds, and even his professors were taken aback by the kind of sounds he recorded and showed to the professors.
That in itself was not something surprising. Many people do not find aesthetic experimentation in music appealing, however highly cultured or innovation-oriented they may be in other fields. But something else intrigued me. He had mentioned electronic music experiments in India. A quick calculation, this must have been sometime in the 1960s. I'd never heard of electronic music experiments in India that early, even before Jaira's Boy. So I asked, who was this? Who was this? His name, said Samir, apparently was Dhvanivala. Why have I never heard of him? I asked. Samir said that he himself also did not really know much about him until recently.
Now, because to my generation, he is an unknown figure, but through my father, I had heard a lot about this gentleman called, and eventually his name Dhvanivala became synonymous with a mythical figure actually.
A mythical figure, indeed. I was a little bit mildly intrigued. But then I wanted to go on with our research conversation until I suddenly remembered something else. Isn't every life a muddled affair? When too much of it fits together, too perfectly, something must be rotten inside. Readers of detective novels know this, but biographers and autobiographers, time and again, smooth over rough spots in the lives they describe. Or inversely, they dramatize them, even when this life itself is boring as hell. They want this life to go down like butter. They explain away the unreasonable, the accidental, the illogical. They speculate about the unknown. If we want to look for traces of the life of this first Indian composer of electronic music, one does not find much that is conclusive. We only have word of mouth and very little actual evidence of his existence. So let us start with the evidence we have. There is this essay from the early 1960s, published in the obscure Journal of the Indian Musicological Society, the idea of the sutra as score, or as a score, as a score. Dhvanivala's experiments with sonic truth, written by none other than the late and much revered stalwart of Indian musicology, Professor Pandit Ashok Ranade. In Pandit Ranade's typically blunt style, this paper offers many quite lucid insights into Dhvanivala's importance as an artist and how useful his way of thinking could have been if it had been taken up by the music establishment in India. Of course, this paper was not really read. But when this article was republished in 2007 by Marg magazine, India's most prominent art periodical, in a shortened and less academic version, Dhvanivala suddenly became a household name in the cultural scene of Mumbai.
Well, Sandeep, some people become myths because they're very salient and there is a publicity machine around them. But other people become myths for the opposite reason. It's because they're elusive, their imprint is felt, but they're only known through traces. So like the painter Gaitonde, for instance.
This is my friend Ranjit Hoskote, cultural critic, highly decorated poet, even though highly decorated sounds more like a pilot than a poet. He's also one of the curators of the art biennials in Kochi and Gwangju. A few years ago, I had asked him for a conversation about Dhvanivala. You'll hear a few excerpts of this conversation throughout my lecture. I wanted to know everything he could tell me. I had my own private reasons. In my parents' household, many years ago, when I, as a boy, was sent to fetch something in the basement, I sometimes had to move aside a shoebox from India, tightly tied up, like a parcel. Written on it in blue ballpoint pen, almost engraved, were some words in Devanagari script that I couldn't read. I have this Indian name, but I cannot read the script. Below these inscriptions, the word Deepak was written with black felt pen in my father's handwriting, and a year, 1967. When you shook the box, it rattled a bit inside, but that was all, nothing spectacular. Once, when my father and me were cleaning out the basement, I think it was in our house in the Kedinger Land near Hamburg. I must have been a teen or so. We again had to shift aside this shoebox. I suddenly asked him what these Devanagari words meant. He took some time to respond. He said the one on the bottom is Sutra, and this top one is Dhvanivala. At the time, I thought, okay, so what does this mean? I could not ask him because he immediately went on, this box belongs to a friend. Some recordings he made back then in Bombay. Indeed, there were 5 cassettes, but they looked different from the ones I knew. Grundig cassettes, my father explained. And he told me the story of how back in the 60s, there had been a battle about the right format for music cassettes. The Dutch company Philips had invented the music cassette, but the German company Grundig came out with their own model a bit later. It had different dimensions, so this is the cassette we all know. Well, the older one, all the ones amongst us know. And this is the Grundig cassette. It had different dimensions, a different playback speed, and of course could only be inserted into Grundig cassette players, obviously. In the late 1950s, my father had studied chemical engineering in Germany, in Darmstadt. Before returning to India as a married man in 1962, he stocked up on quality German goods, Klein & Hummel loudspeakers, a dual turntable, and a Grundig stereo system. No wonder then that my mother's father, my German grandfather, would also send him the newest Grundig cassette recorder when it came out. Even in their loud apartment, all those joint family members shouting in various tongues, all windows always open to the noises of a never-sleeping, noise-loving city, my father had remained a real devotee to the high-fidelity movement. A movement that had evolved in and deeply relied on the boredom of those quiet rooms, on the deafening silences that inhabit those winterly, insulated, antisocial, one-person, one-family homes of the global north. Is the desire for pure high-fidelity sound an indicator of a colonial mindset? Is the desire for the suppression of noise somehow related to the desire to suppress diversity? Anyway, after one desperate year, Grundig lost against Philips. Maybe the Grundig cassettes had too much hiss and noise, or the Dutch were better than the Germans at conquering the world outside of Europe. Whatever the reasons, the MCs in Grundig's design were discontinued. From now on, every auto rickshaw and taxi in Bombay and everywhere else for decades would play their blaring music only on Philips MCs. My father's Grundig recorder itself eventually stopped working in that humid and dusty subtropical climate. But these 5 Grundig cassettes that no one could listen to anymore, he had kept them close by. On a shelf in the basement of every house our family lived in. I did not then ask the obvious question, why? Something else came up, probably a call to come up for dinner. Only almost 30 years later, when my friend Samir casually mentioned the name Dhvanivala in this story about his father, did I make this connection. Father's sound recording, studies in Germany, Dhvanivala. And right there, from the rehearsal in Pune, eager to confirm my deductions, I called home. This home, as usual in our family, was in flux. At that particular moment when I called, our home was once more shifting to a new place. For the last time in my father's life, my old parents were moving their household. From the shore of Lac Léman, with the view of the Mont Blanc, they migrated back to Germany, where their love story had once begun.
प्यार प्यार ना रहा जिंदगी हमें तेरा एतबार ना रहा एतबार ना रहा दोस्त दोस्त ना रहा प्यार प्यार ना रहा जिंदगी हमें तेरा एतबार ना रहा एतबार ना रहा
This movie, called Sangam, was the first movie, Bollywood movie, that my mother saw when she arrived as the wife of my father in Bombay in 1962. And she has taken particularly this song as the kind of song that defined her time in India a little bit. So she still listens to it. But let's move back even a few more years. To Darmstadt. Mathildenhöhe. A summer afternoon in 1960. Darmstadt. Known for years by Indian students as the city with one of the best technical universities in Germany. A nirvana for young engineers from Madras, Calcutta, Ahmedabad, Pune, and Bombay. Oh, sorry. In addition to all the attractions of a city with a good university, Darmstadt also was conveniently located in a country that had fought against the British Empire, against their former oppressors. My father came from a family whose members were deeply involved in the independence struggle. His own father, my Indian grandfather Kakaji, had been imprisoned many times by the British. To go to Cambridge or London for his studies was out of the question. So he too studied here, in Darmstadt, to become a chemical engineer, and on that light-flooded Sunday afternoon, he went for a walk. Going for a walk, spazieren gehen, was a German habit he had picked up here. In the India of his youth, people practically never went for a walk just for pleasure. It was far too hot and dusty outside. He took this particular walk with another student from India whose name was supposedly Deepak Gandharva. Supposedly, because that name sounds like a pseudonym. A Gandharva sorry, I'm mixing up my pages. A Gandharva is a heavenly musical being. If you translate this concept into Judeo-Christian mythology, this is similar to a cherub or something like that, cherubim. An exceptional musician might be named Gandharva as a kind of honorific title. Deepak Gandharva as the official name of a person, that's as somebody around here had the name of Amadeus Cherub or something like this. Who would believe that even in a novel? Anyway, the two are on their walk. And at some point, they slowly ascend the Mathildenhöhe towards the Hochzeitsturm, the wedding tower, famous for its five-fingered crown. Two young Indians, both in their early 20s, ardently gesticulating. The subject of their conversation is Homi Jahangir Bhabha, India's most famous physicist. The discoverer of the Bhabha scattering, a revolutionary insight in nuclear physics. This is the paper from the 1930s. After independence, Homi J. Bhabha became the head of India's nuclear research program and worked with the United Nations on peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And at the same time, he was a great promoter and collector of cutting-edge art, a connoisseur of both classical musics, that of the West and that of Hindustan. Deepak Gandharva admires him unconditionally. A true Renaissance man, he exclaims, and he tries out the bold statement, any serious scientist today must always be an artist as well. My father laughs and teases him, Are Deepak, I've never even seen you draw a tiny little line without a ruler in your hand. Gandharva is about to reply to this taunt, but when they are interrupted by a strange sound. Was this a kind of siren? Like the one in their labs? But the sound lasts longer and changes. A malfunction, perhaps? Or an alarm? Should they perhaps offer their help? Gandharva and my father have arrived just below the Hochzeitsturm. But the sound does not come from there. It seems to come from the Kunsthalle, from the exhibition hall behind it. Where was the entrance again? They run around the building to the other side. Here a door stands wide open. The sound is lower now, beeps that buzz through the air like mad insects. Sounds dangerous. Entering from the bright sun into the gloom, they see no sculptures nor any paintings, but rows of chairs and a stage. On this stage, a few technicians are milling about, working on some equipment. This is where the sound comes from. My father, the engineer, is fascinated. Is this perhaps an acoustic measurement of the space? Some kind of impulse response assessment? Obviously, the hall is set up for concerts. And in Germany, he has already noticed that in his short time here. Germany is a country that takes everything very seriously, including and especially its music. He would not be surprised if these people were precisely measuring the acoustics of the hall to improve the sound of tonight's concert. At that very moment, a man heads towards them. Here I must insert a parenthesis. It would have been very nice for my story if this man had been Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the famous and later infamous composer. He could have been, at least according to my father's descriptions. Sandeep, he had such wild eyes, really intense, and he seemed quite arrogant. But to be fair, that description would probably apply to many composers of that time. So was it Stockhausen? Maybe, maybe not. Parenthesis closed. The man tells them, in a stage whisper, not to enter the rehearsal. A rehearsal? For what? Asks Gandharva. For our concert tonight. I don't see any instruments, said my father, who has a good ear. His idol is Bollywood star Raj Kapoor. And my father, like him, plays the accordion. The man smiles. He seems to think people in India are still a little backwards. What a great opportunity to do some preaching.
Die internationalen Ferienkurse für neue Musik unter Leitung von Dr. Wolfgang Steinecke auf der Marienhöhe waren das Ziel junger Musiker aus 32 Ländern der Erde. Zum 15. Male Internationalität, Konzerte, Diskussionen, Experimente und Fortschritt. Prominenz aus aller Welt leitet die Seminare. Maurizio Kagel aus Argentinien im Harfenseminar.
This is new music, electronic music. We make it here with those instruments, microphones, oscillators, and multi-track tape machines, he proclaims. You can hear how proud he is of the fact that they use such technologically advanced equipment. And is that an artificial echo? Whispers Gandharva, pointing to a kind of chest of drawers in front of which dozens of tape loops are piled up, forming almost Baroque patterns. Surprised, the man answers, yes, that's right. Maybe these Indians are not so far behind the moon after all. The whistling and buzzing still resounds in the hall. A glassy clanging sometimes mixed in, and now and then something that rumbles. My father has heard enough. The matter is resolved. This was no alarm. He wants to go outside again and continue the walk. Gandharva, however, does not move. He stands as if in a trance, listens, closely examines these electronic devices, observes their operations. And, his head tilted sideways, he absorbs the missionary monologue of this intense man, Stockhausen maybe, who sharply whispers to him, his hands cutting violent curves into the air. Deepak Gandharva's eyes shine. Darmstadt had once been famous for its scientific breakthroughs. But after the Second World War, Darmstadt's technical university was only a shadow of its former self. 92% of the labs had been destroyed. For almost 2 decades, the university had to improvise. Deepak Gandharva worked in one of the many outstation physics labs, this one in a rundown, bomb-damaged mansion in the Alisenstraße. There he investigated correlations of spin and momentum in the Babar scattering. His thesis was a highly mathematical work, but not without any practical application. A Babar scattering occurs when an electron collides with a positron. And Gandharva's formulation were supposed to help particle physicists to determine, for example, the radiation in synchrotrons. My father, who lived not far away, sometimes came by to pick him up for dinner. You cannot imagine, Sandeep, how often Deepak just forgot to eat. One evening, a few weeks after the encounter on Mathildenhöhe, my father thus chanced upon ample evidence of Gandharva's new love, electronic sound making. But not with machines. He had built his own sound making setups, quite unique. When my father opened the old wooden door, he saw that the entire corridor behind it was crisscrossed with coils of electric cables, a labyrinth of insulated wires. 2 microphones were installed in the middle, around them small loudspeakers, probably from old radios. Here and there across the floor, they were scattered, making scratchy, buzzy, but sometimes also quite harmonious sounds. My father remarked to me later that Deepak's sound world, sound living room, had reminded him of a jungle. And in this jungle, between all these curling and hanging cables, Gandharva ran back and forth, arms flapping like a bird, chasing after sounds, which seemed to float in the corridor. "It works! It works!" he exclaimed over and over again, and his words and the flapping produced new sounds from his electric spider's web. The tiny loudspeakers crackled and sizzled.
He obviously was fascinated by the scattering of sounds, how they picked up by a microphone in one place, moved in diverse feedbacks through his architectures of cables and microphones, becoming more and more blurred. In general, he seemed to have been deeply fascinated by processes of scattering and evaporation. How does the concrete and clearly outlined on contact with reality become increasingly indistinct and blurred, so much so that at some point it can no longer even be traced? This very process of volatilization, was it perhaps a symbol for his own untraceable existence?
Foreign returned. After his return from Germany, almost at the same time as my parents, Deepak Gandharva's value increased immeasurably. A PhD who had returned from foreign, was immensely valuable on the marriage market. But Gandharva showed no interest. For immediately after his return, he had landed a dream job as a researcher at the Trombay Nuclear Research Center, located on a small peninsula in the Bay of Bombay. The Canadian government had just installed a heavy water reactor there called Cyrus. The Americans supplied the uranium. Research was in full swing. India desperately wanted the atomic bomb and cheap electricity for the growing megalopolis of Bombay, whose lights could be seen blinking across the small gulf. So Gandharva became a person with military secret clearance. My parents remember a visit from 2 very polite gentlemen who discreetly inquired about any possible indiscretions in Gandharva's German life. The best part about Gandharva's job was daily contact with his idol, Homi Jahangir Bhabha, the director of the Trombay Nuclear Research Center. And what is more, Bhabha, this lover of contemporary art and of classical music, apparently even allowed Gandharva to pursue his sound studies on the side, provided they did not interfere with his normal research. And it was surely Bhabha who also brought him into contact with the metropolitan art scene. Bhabha was a patron and collector of the painters who had formed the Progressive Art Group, a movement that shook up India's art scene in the 1950s and 60s. They all used to meet right in the epicenter of former British Bombay, the so-called Fort area, at Jahangir Art Gallery.
And the Jahangir Art Gallery was very, very young. It had opened in the early 50s. So in the mid-60s, it was a very lively institution. And it wasn't only a space of exhibition. It also was a social space where poets, novelists, musicians, painters, of course, art critics, people from theatre and dance would all meet. So it was a very confluential place where all kinds of new ideas would be essayed. And so Dhvanivala was important in that milieu because he brought in questions of undecidability or indeterminacy, questions that a little later would be identified with a new way of thinking about physics and its relationship to the larger world. The world of science is not the world that the people in the art world knew. I mean, they knew vaguely that he was connected to the sciences, but were not aware of the security implications of a lot of his projects.
Well, in Germany, nuclear reactors are the focus of a lot of artistic, but also a lot of societal attention. How has this played out in India? This Trombay facility has been there for 50, 60 years.
That's right, absolutely.
Is there an engagement of the art scene? Has there been an engagement of the art scene in society with the possibilities and dangers of this situation?
Let me put it this way. I think most Indians are probably unique in the world in not truly having a sense of the horror of nuclear warfare. There's still an amazing nationalist feeling that, we have the bomb. So, which is why even in TV debates, for instance, or what you read on social media, it's so easy for many people to say, well, we should nuke them meaning, of course, our friends across the border. And you're amazed that there can be such lightness and facetiousness about something that is catastrophic beyond belief. So in the same way, the presence of the reactor here is naturalized into the public consciousness. People don't realize that there's a major military target that is in our neighborhood. They also don't realize that in the event of a meltdown, we're in the center of the danger zone. There's no escape. And finally, in the art world particularly, I think most people don't even see the reactor because Homi Bhabha is seen less as a scientist and a strategist and more as a watercolorist and a portrait of the arts, or a patron of the arts, which is what he was. So when people think of him, they think of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, the absolutely beautiful collection of art that he and his successors put together. It acts as really a benchmark collection for certain decades in Indian art, in modern Indian art. So that again is really a way of neutralizing and naturalizing the bare, cruel fact of something that has place in really a pathology of war. So, the reactor gets neutralized under the garb of education and, the scientific tempo, which is a famous Nehruvian phrase that's still very commonly used in India. The temples of the future is exactly what Nehru is. That comes from a speech of Nehru's when he inaugurated the Bhakra Nangal Dam. But it's thanks to films division and the documentaries, that phrase is always the voiceover when you're looking at dams, reactors.
Thank you, Ranjit. Temples of the future indeed. For at least the next 100,000 years, to be sure. By the way, it's striking that Hoskote does not use the name Deepak Gandharva at all. In those artistic circles, everybody seems to have known him only as Dhvanivala. And this is the name under which he is still known today. However, he apparently did not invent this pseudonym himself. It had already fallen to him in his first days as a foreign returned. Rahul Dev Burman, known to everyone as Pancham, was one of the most important and innovative composers of Bollywood cinema. In Bollywood cinema, they're called music directors. R.D. Burman was always on the lookout for unusual sounds. Sometimes a famous singer had to gurgle water in the background. Sometimes his percussion group was a bunch of plates and teacups. His ears were everywhere. Especially these new electronic sounds fascinated him. Kersey Lord, his keyboard musician of many years, remembers.
We had one composer, R.D. Burman. He was always very futuristic. Pancham, we call him. So when we started playing, and he used to come sometime. Kaise? First, he'll call me at 2:30 in the night, 1 o'clock in the night. Are you asleep? In Hindi. I said, no, now I'm awake. Na? Okay, I'm coming over. So he'll bring a scotch bottle, 2 glasses, and he'll sit down and discuss, I want this sound. Now he'll come up with, boop, 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 boop. I said, how can I get that sound? We don't have anything that produces. So why do you think I kept you? I want that sound ready. So then 6-7 days I'm thinking what to do.
Kersey Lord turned to Deepak Gandharva, who had just returned from Germany and was still living with his parents in Bombay's posh Pali Hill district, very near to Kersey Lord. In fact, he was his neighbor. Possibly the two had been in school together. In any case, Kersey Lord knew that Deepak Gandharva, whom he called Didi, would be able to help him.
And his hobby was electronics. So I asked him, so Didi, for urgent day, I want something like, I got 4 oscillators I want in one dabba, 3 octave switches for each, and waveforms, sine wave, a square wave, and a sawtooth. If you can do it within 6 to 3 days, I'll be very happy. So Didi goes home, finds out all his circuits and all. He says, yeah, we can do it. Na? So he did it, and then I used after 7 days. Na? I manually, 4 operators, 4 oscillators, switches, whatever you want, mono out, not even stereo out. Na? There is lying there somewhere, you will see it. Na?
So let us listen to the result of this collaboration. This is a published soundtrack of a Bollywood film, music by Rahul Dev Burman. After this first sound rescue, Gandharva's role for Bollywood was established. He was the sound doctor, the equivalent of the script doctor, who anonymously, but presumably for good money, solved sound problems. No one in Bollywood cared that they were dealing with a world-class physicist. To them, he was simply their Dhvanivala, their sound provider.
He was never considered perhaps as a musician. But still he dealt with some strange kinds of sounds. So he must have been regarded as a Dhvanivala. Like we had Kanchwala who deals with glass. We have, say, motor mechanic, so he is Motorwala. We have grocery store Wala. So all those Wala is actually a person who has that repertoire. So he had perhaps the repertoire of Dhvani. So he was categorized as a person, and that name was given to him. That is my guess.
In the year after his return, Gandharva or Dhvanivala cleverly managed to evade the so-called auntie network, that unofficial but very powerful family cartel of mothers and aunts that relentlessly arranges marriages of young people. The job in Trombay helped the isolated residents of in a kind of industrial area. The smell of the military, so inelegant for the upper classes. He was not interested in women anyway. In Indian myths, both the biological and the social gender is often ambivalent, and gods as well as humans change gender. And then continue to live with their previous partner now of the same sex. An entire gender ambivalent population, the Hijras, live in a publicly recognized existence. India is one of the few countries whose passport can show a third gender. But if this was indeed his inclination, Dhvanivala had to be careful in 1960s India. After India had been swallowed by the British Empire, all laissez-faire in sexual morals was immediately over. From 1861 onwards, Victorian homophobic laws also applied to India. When this repressive climate slowly began to ease in Europe, India for a long time found a part of its post-colonial resistance in the rejection of this westernized, foreign, gay emancipation. So the fact that Gandharva was privy to military secrets might also explain why no one I talked to ever mentioned any flirtation or relationship. No lover, no former one-night stand has ever gone public since Dhvanivala's re-emergence through the Marg article into India's cultural scene. Maybe he had adopted yet another name for the private nightly parties that were Bombay's hidden gay scene in the 1960s. Another scenario is also possible. Pleasure is only human, but the ascetic life is divine. Satisfying sensual desires is only natural, but those who wish to ascend to a higher consciousness should tone down or avoid food, comfort, intoxication, and sex. A strongly intellectual person, such as Dhvanivala, was certainly receptive to these ancient Indian values too. They are like the Protestant work ethic in the West. You can smell them everywhere in India.
And also remember that as someone working in the nuclear establishment, he would have been working with colleagues who came from fairly conservative backgrounds. If you look at the kind of ethnography of the nuclear establishment, it's dominated to a considerable extent by Tamil Brahmins of fairly conservative social background. So there is also that to be thought about. And he also straddled those worlds. The world of scripture and the puja, with the world of scientific inquiry and investigation and experiment, then all of the things he was doing as a secret artist, and then his associations with other kinds of people out in the metropolis.
This city on 7 islands on the eastern edge of the Indian Ocean has never been called the Indian Rome. For Bombay, the archipelago once discovered and settled by the Portuguese, has never been the capital of any empire whatsoever. Made up of hundreds of ethnic groups, all of them immigrants, traders, and soldiers of fortune, Bombay, for most of its history has been more about getting along on a day-to-day basis and to simply ignore all flashpoints of faith. It's not that religion does not play a role in the everyday life of Bombayites. If something is wrong, of course one asks the god or goddess in charge for help. If it is about money, then you go to the Mahalakshmi Mandir, the temple of the goddess of wealth. It looks westward, out on the Arabian Sea, from where, over so many centuries, rich cargo was always due to arrive. A very good location. So the cargo came from Portugal, Arabia, East Africa, and England later. This Hindu temple was open to everyone. But one could also quickly send some imploring words out to the Haji Ali Mosque that floats like a white island on the waves near Mahalakshmi. And finally, just to be on the safe side, one could also drop by in a church, even argue with God near the synagogue. Praying is good, but spreading one's options is better.
But Bombay being Bombay, it has its robust, everyday vernacular cosmopolitanism, because there really is no single community that can claim to belong here, although the Maharashtrians do make that claim. The fact is that there's an incredible degree of interdependence. So the city speaks many languages, it transits very easily from one form of belief to another, the culture is confluential. So it would take many, many decades, in fact, for a properly right-wing government to take power, which didn't happen till the late 90s, 30 years after these events.
Dhvanivala's Bombay seems to have been even more complex than that of most residents of this city. From the pillars of society in his parents' home on Pali Hill, to the researchers in Trombay, from the art revolutionaries of Jahangir Art Gallery, to the pragmatically creative in Bollywood's Dream Factory, his life of crisscrossing wires and connections resounded only in his person, grounded perhaps by nightly intercourse with those who kept the city alive. Working class waiters and rickshaw drivers, merchants and managers, princes and artists. When I first heard Samir speak of Dhvanivala, he lamented how there seems to be no audio trace of his work, that all the sounds he ever made are probably lost, that no one alive had ever actually heard any of his experiments. I suddenly knew what these cassettes in my parents' basement actually were. I called my parents. I was already imagining how I would get the magnetic tapes out of the cassettes, put them into Philips cassette tapes, then digitally record that. The different speed would be easy to compensate for digitally. As I mentioned before, my parents were moving. How should I know where your shoebox is now? You should see the chaos around here, my mother said. Not a good moment for a call. Dhvanivala's shoebox never reappeared from the chaos. Many things went missing on this last move. I like to imagine that they went up in flames in an incinerator near Lake Geneva, and that some soot particles of Dhvanivala's collected works now rest on a glacier, somewhere near the Mont Blanc. In a way, that would be fitting. For it was there, on Mont Blanc, that Dhvanivala's idol and boss, Homi Jahangir Bhabha, had died in the crash of Air India Flight 101 on January 24, 1966. He had been on his way to Vienna for the UN conference on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, which Bhabha was supposed to chair. Bhabha's death at the height of his career is, of course, the subject of many conspiracy theories. Apparently, the CIA had wanted to slow down India's nuclear program. Others say it was the KGB. It could also have been a scattering of positrons, a gust of air, or sloppy maintenance that caused the plane to crash into the mountain. In his famous paper, Pandit Ashok Ranade explains how Dhvanivala's work was centered on the notion of the sutra. A sutra is a short instruction for a complicated action. The Vayu Purana, an ancient scripture, says it as it is. In sparse words, clear, comprehensive, concise, condensed in one breath, such is a sutra. Dhvanivala apparently never made a recording without writing down beforehand what should be heard on it, what the source would be, and what kind of aesthetic perception he wanted to achieve. Some descriptions are only technical, but others are quite poetic. Especially in his later phase, when he transitioned from electronic tinkering to recording the sounds of Bombay in his sutra, they became almost poems in their own right. In them he describes the sounds of cafes, especially the worldly Irani cafes, the sound of commuter trains at Churchgate Station, the sounds of family on Juhu Beach in the north, the honking and the noise on Pedder Road, a long street, notorious for its traffic jams, even then leading to the Mahalakshmi Mandir. I like one of these poems, descriptions, scores, especially. To me, it evokes the early morning atmosphere of Shivaji Park, where my grandparents' house is, and where I recorded the soundscape one morning in 2015, shortly after my father's death. Sutra 23, the crow registries. It starts with cawing, hesitant and from afar at first, then shrieking and close to the ear, reply, confirmation, approval, stamp, okay. Then cawing again, precisely modulated, sprawling across the park, recitals on the trees all around, index, table thickets, catalogs, litanies. This is how they keep records. Those smoothly oiled heads, accurate pronunciations, all fields filled out, all frequencies covered, all voids black voiced, as if nothing could exist without their meticulous enumerations. Nothing new, nothing old, as if no truth was needed beyond their croaks. The fifth floor of a house called Morning Breeze on wooded Kambala Hill was my childhood home. Windows on all sides. From there, even as a small boy, one could see far into the world. On one side, to the southwest, one could look across the flat white roofs of the neighboring houses and the treetops to the endless blue-gray Arabian Sea. On the other side, the eye sailed over the cliffs, the wooded plain of the Willingdon Golf Club, the racecourse, and past skyscrapers, towers, to the flares of the Trombay refineries and nuclear plants, 20 kilometers away in the northeast. On the crest of a hill, the cooling breezes from sea and land crossed each other in our flat. Our windows were always open. This flat also served as Dhvanivala's base camp when he had to stay in the city for a few days. My German mother, at his request, cooked German dishes for him. Sauerbraten, Schnitzel, Königsberger Klopse. And in the evenings, the three of them would remember their student years in the mild climate of Darmstadt, the golden autumn days along the Weinstraße, and unimaginable in the Bombay heat, those winter walks in silently falling, white, cold snow. My father's high-fidelity stereo system was another reason for Dhvanivala's visits. It served as a copying and mixing station for his sounds when he didn't have access to the studios of Bollywood. On a winter day in 1967, everything felt like a normal visit. After a scientific colloquium at the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research in southern Bombay, Deepak had arrived at our home in the late afternoon. He copied till late in the evening, smoking, eating, joking, and drinking. I must have been 4 years old. I have no memories of him. But my parents later told me that he could always make me laugh. A grimace, a funny movement, a little magic trick. Around midnight, he said goodbye, in a good mood. Carefully took his big tape reels with him, but left behind a small stack of cassettes, the shoebox. They never saw him again. Inquiries by his family and at some point by the police may have happened, but certainly much later. Everyone probably thought that he was somewhere else, pursuing one of his many interests. At the Baba Research Center, too, they were used to his long absences. So far, he had always returned with a brilliant idea. Deepak Gandhara did not turn into a criminal case, no corpse in the morning paper. To this day, no one has managed to find out what happened to him. Perhaps military intelligence knows more, but to his friends, his family, the artist circles in Jahangir Art Gallery, his Bollywood neighbors, he was simply gone, all of a sudden, as if he had vanished into thin air, scattered into the winds, disappeared into cosmic background radiation. All that my parents had left were a few recordings. They told me that they had listened to these cassettes over and over again, hoping that these tapes could tell them something about Dhvanivala's disappearance. It was very strange. Just people talking and children screaming. Monkeys and birds, honking cars, and waves on the beach, panwalas shouting in the street, and in between, long stretches of some electronic sounds. Would I call it music? Maybe you would, Sandeep. You're an electronic composer yourself. But I really don't know.
And in fact, my wife Nancy Arjani, who's a theorist, has written about this era and this tendency. She has a paper that's called From No Context Media to New Media. So she talks about how a number of these artists were experimenting with non-painterly media, but these experiments had no context in the art world, or the art market specifically. So they themselves tended to be a bit suspicious of what they were doing, whether it was in cinema or sound art, or the space of collaboration.
So in a sense, Dhvanivala also would consider his experiments in sound as not the real thing? That's what you're saying?
I think he may have not quite known where to place this work, because I personally, I don't know the extent to which he was aware of other kinds of initiatives that were going on. Xenakis, for instance, concrete music. I can't offhand remember the dates, but there were people who were active at Cage. There were people active in mathematics or architecture or performance who were moving towards this convergence of the sciences and music, or sound is music, or the notion of found music. I don't know to what extent he was aware of this, but it strikes me that he lived in covert subcultures. So much about Dhvanivala is penumbral, and we have only clues and traces.
Eventually, his name Dhvanivala became synonymous with a mythical figure actually. Indian mythology tells us that Dhvani was created in a void actually. And that void was filled with Dhvani because the Brahman willed one day that he wanted to express something. So the expressive power, as we call it as Vak in Sanskrit, it was activated and then Dhvani came about in a void. That is the Shabda, the final element. So he is now considered as a mythical figure who was instrumental in creating of that sound.
Thank you.